Critiquing FromSoft's games is hard. Often, it gets mired in debates about difficulty. And this time around, it sparked a Steam review bombing, which I really don't want to contribute to. Elden Ring Shadows of the Erdtree is overall great, and very worth your time. And my critique is very subjective, and it's centered at the direction with one character. It's a criticism of something that won't bother most players. Nevertheless, it's something that really bugged me, and I wanted to put it out in the world. There's no way to discuss this without spoilers, so before watching this, please go play it for yourself. It's an experience that I'd recommend. That was your last chance to avoid spoilers. I need to talk about Miquella. It's important to understand that many of Elden Ring's characters were written by multiple people, Miquella included. According to the game's director, Hidetaka Miyazaki, George R.R. Martin was responsible for writing the mythos of Elden Ring. It was a collaborative effort where Miyazaki and his team dictated what they needed to make a game world, while the actual specifics of who the demigods were and why they were warring seems to have been left up to Martin. What this means is that Miquella's character was likely laid out by Martin. With this knowledge, I believe that his intentions with this character were to create someone who longed for a better world, but was unable to create it. A failed hero from the previous age. This parallels the way he writes some characters in his other works, like Rhaegar Targaryen. There is credibility to this assumption of Miquella's character, as in an early version of the game, he would ask the player to share in his vision and create his idealized world. If thou covetest the throne, impress my vision upon thine heart. In the new world of thy making, all things will flourish, whether graceful or malign. Now that we have a rough understanding of Miquella's character outline, we need to evaluate the direction that FromSoft went with Miquella in the final product. He underwent a full rework at some point in development. Initially, he was to be within his cocoon in the Halo tree before emerging mid-fight with Malenia, the player presumably unlocking his ending upon her defeat. They decided against that later on and introduced Mog. At some point, they cut his ending entirely, opting to paint him as someone more sinister instead. FromSoft has a history of pulling from Berserk in their games, and in the case of Miquella, their direction with him shifted to be someone willing to sacrifice everything for their idealized world. This is a parallel to Griffith from Berserk. We even see references to an eclipse in Castle Sol. I ignored this direction with him prior to the DLC because it wasn't associated with any actual content. We see from content in the game the kind of person Miquella was originally. He crafted the unalloyed needle to help Malenia fight the Scarlet Rot, the same one the player uses to subdue the Frenzied Flame. In the waking of his brother Godwyn, as the Prince of Death, he tries to put him out of his misery, and he houses those persecuted by his mother's golden order in his Halig tree. These are not the actions of some master manipulator, using everyone to achieve his vision. This will be relevant with their direction with him in the DLC, so keep it in mind. In a cruel twist, Miquella would be kidnapped and used for Mog's attempts at creating his own dynasty. This would leave his tree to decay, Malenia to weather the Scarlet Rot alone, and Godwyn's soulless corpse to wreak havoc on the roots of the Erdtree. I find this to be a very fitting role for Miquella. Prior to the DLC, he was probably my favorite character. His failure in kidnapping is partially what leads to the player's involvement, but I still would have liked to have seen Miquella's cut Age of Abundance ending here. His entire life had been dedicated to helping people, but it was for nothing. So he would enlist you, after being rescued from Mog. But they had already made the decision to go in a different direction with him by this point in development, and likely planned to have some kind of boss fight within his dream in Mogwood Dynasty. You know, similar to how Godwyn has a boss fight connected to his dreams. Now we come to the DLC, where I had high hopes that we would finally get to engage with Miquella after seeing the art of him riding upon Torrent. But on arrival, only vestiges of him are found. Miquella apparently divested himself of all that he thought stood between himself and his vision. Among the parts of him that are cast off, we find that he is disposed of his love, which seems to be embodied by Saint Trina. She implores us to kill Miquella to prevent him from becoming a god, because it would be like imprisonment to him. I don't dislike Saint Trina, but her role in the DLC bothers me. It's as if everything I liked about Miquella was actually Saint Trina all along. This feels like a character betrayal to me. Furthermore, I feel like I was misled by the marketing of the DLC. I was shown art of Miquella riding Torrent and saw a trailer where he was asking for a consort, so I don't think it was an unreasonable assumption to think he would be more involved with the player. This also had potential to loop around to the beginning of the game, when Melina and Ranni gave us vital tools from Torrent's former master. Had it been Miquella, the DLC could have been directly tied in with the base game. He would have lent you Torrent and the Spirit Calling Bell, in the hopes that you would succeed him, with Melina and Ranni guiding you. This also would have tied in with his cut ending, further reason for why I feel the direction was a mistake. So who was Torrent's former master? I guess we'll never actually know, because it wasn't explored in the DLC, when they had the chance. It's also important to recognize what this direction with Miquella means with continuity. In the base game, Mog kidnapped Miquella, preventing him from nourishing his Halig tree and causing its decline. But according to Ansbach, one of our new friends, Mog was in fact enchanted by Miquella, meaning that Malenia having to weather the Scarlet Rot and the decaying of the Halig tree would have been an intentional decision by Miquella. One that doesn't make much sense to me. Why would he need to leave his Halig tree at that very moment? Couldn't he have waited? Furthermore, how could he have enchanted Mog from inside his cocoon in the Halig tree? Even if we assume that Mog was enchanted after he kidnapped Miquella, what would stop him from returning to the Halig tree after he enchanted Mog? His abandonment doesn't make any sense to me. With this direction of his character, Malenia was sent to kill Radahn so that Miquella could claim his soul and put it in Mog's body, whom he enchanted to kidnap him and drain his life so that he could enter the Lands of Shadow, which means he also planned on Mog being stopped somehow. All of that, rather than just, being with Radahn and helping him become Elden Lord. You really have to suspend your disbelief for any of it to make sense. Never mind how many eons Miquella must have been waiting for somebody to stop Mog. I also have to ask, Malenia was fighting Radahn in order to send him to Miquella, so who exactly was involved in the Shattering War? It seems now that neither Malenia nor Radahn were fighting for the throne of Elden Lord. Miquella would still be in his cocoon at that time. We know that Godric was fleeing Lindel and Renala was already in her fragile state by this point. Was the Great War of the Demigods just between Morgott and Rykard? With that in mind, we come to the final encounters of Shadows of the Erd Tree. In the penultimate encounter, we are met by Miquella's followers and reminded that we are an agent of the Greater Will and are guided by its grace. We're then forced to kill them all in a big anime betrayal moment. This is when I broke from the experience. I had no desire to stop Miquella's ascension to godhood, yet the role was assigned to me. We are removed the ability to have any kind of agency. I think his plan was meant to be more sinister than it came across to me, but his ability to compel people to follow his will and not fight with each other was broken with his Great Rune. And yet, most of his followers are still loyal to him, proving that he's not manipulating them. Presumably, he would be using his powers of charming, that he somehow still has despite his Great Rune shattering, to force people to comply with his new world. Which in our non-video game reality would be abhorrent. But in the lands between, where everything has decayed to ruin and the Greater Will's plan is to send wave after wave of Tarnished until one of them happens to become Elden Lord, I don't think Miquella's plan is any worse than the Greater Will's. I'm sure many would disagree with that point, but that's only part of the issue. I also need to lament the loss of Miquella's followers. I felt that the base game killed off too many characters. By the end of the experience, the world feels empty to me. The DLC adding a bunch of new characters at the beginning felt like an attempt to undo that mistake. But imagine if more characters from the base game survived and joined you in the Lands of Shadow instead. It feels very short-sighted to just kill off nearly every character, and I hoped that FromSoft would have learned that during the development of the DLC. But apparently not, because they all just die again. In the final encounter, Miquella is directly contradictory of what we are told about him from his scattered remains. We are shown that he has lost his greater rune, and with it his ability to control others. I don't see any other way to interpret this, as 2 of his followers can join you in your final fight against him. And we are also shown that he has removed his love, presumably by divesting himself of Saint Trina. Yet in our final encounter, loveless Miquella is shown to be lovingly embracing Radahn and still using his powers of charming on the player, despite his rune breaking. He even has a non-lethal game over move where he steals your heart. He doesn't want to kill the player, he wants you to join him. This shows me that FromSoft didn't know how to portray Miquella without his love. And what would he even be without it? I don't think FromSoft could answer that, because that's all there was to him. That's why I believe Miquella deserved better treatment from FromSoft. They had to stretch his character and the game's lore in order to bend him into a villain, and the villain we got as a result wasn't terribly compelling. Oh well. It's just a video game, and the DLC was still pretty fun. I wanted to leave off with what I would have liked to have seen in the DLC, because I don't think it's very helpful to criticize something without offering alternatives. I don't think any of these ideas are necessarily better than what we got. It's more like a general list of things I would have been more interested in exploring. I would have liked to have seen Miquella as a party member, effectively taking Melina's place as our maiden or level up lad. He would be converting the Shadow Tree fragments into power for our character. Upon arriving in the Lands of Shadow, he would reveal that he's been calling to us for help, and that he was the one who bequeathed Torrent and the Spirit Calling Bell to us, with the help of his sisters. His main goal would be to stop Messmer's persecution of the Horn Scent, undoing what he considers his mother's worst mistake. According to Miyazaki, the story of the DLC was based on George R.R. Martin's pre-established mythos. Presumably, this means Miquella's love for Radahn, as it was his driving motivation. I think that Miquella's relationship with Trina, Mog, and Radahn should have also tied in with the player more. Maybe some extra dialogue with Miquella about the player killing Melania and Radahn. I really liked how some of Miquella's followers chose whether or not to continue following him based on the player's actions. I would want to expand on that more. For example, Miquella, still in love with Radahn, would want to craft a spirit ash with his soul. Freya, being a former soldier of Radahn, would see this as evidence that Miquella is someone worth following, and thus doesn't abandon his side despite his rune shattering. Maybe the reward is a spirit ash of Radahn for the player, with Miquella having granted his beloved's wish for an endless festival. This would be a very sweet moment, and it would tie in with him sending the Spirit Calling Bell to the player. Please feel free to include your own thoughts. This was the first time I've ever felt compelled to make a video about something, and I enjoyed the process. I have a few more video ideas that I also feel strongly about, so maybe more coming. Thank you.